Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nathan. We're not familiar. My background is in cybersecurity, information systems, a little bit of data analysis as well. I spent some time as a 25 Bravo computer tech specialist with the Army Reserves. Did some work with the Guard as well. So, what are we going to do in this video? Very simple. We have a Minnesota historical report. We have covered Minnesota pretty extensively so far. We've put out other reports, but this one actually looks at multiple elections going back all the way to 1984. So let me give you a summary here. Overview. We're going to give you an executive summary of the concerns raised in the report. We're going to talk a little bit about the systems used across all of these different elections, the methods we used to analyze the voting data for all of those elections, and then key findings visualized and some multi-state comparisons for the 24 election, similar systems. Summarized, we looked at 11 presidential elections in Minnesota going back throughout the ages, so 1984 all the way up to 2024. We analyzed the precinct level voting data, which is public. You can get it from the counties or the state. You can get it from the state. And we analyzed it using multiple forensic methods that have been used to look at election fraud in other elections, like in Russia. And what we have flagged is a noticeable and concerning relationship occurring in recent elections, starting in 2016, which raises concerns of potential algorithmic compromise of the voting behavior, the voting systems we use to count our votes. So let's talk about our systems. This is the most important thing. This is what the ETA has been doing a deep dive in. Those of our volunteers who work in cybersecurity and computer systems have spent a lot of time investigating this. And the concern is, at this point, 70% of the U.S. uses two major voting systems. And a lot of the pushback we get when we do the data analysis and we put out our findings is, well, it would be very difficult to compromise U.S. elections because every state runs their own election, which they do, and every state uses systems that, aren't connected to the internet. Well, we're going to talk about that. But if you could compromise these two major brands, they span 70% or more of the U.S., then yes, you could change the outcome of elections if you could pull it off. Now, what has been flagged is that we know these systems at this point have been compromised. The major number one brand is ES&S. Second largest brand now is Liberty Vote, which was Dominion. And we know that these systems were targeted and were successfully compromised as per Free Speech for People, cybersecurity experts. Some examples of this is in Coffee County, Georgia, early 2020, 2021. AP reported on this, where individuals were allowed to gain access to the voting infrastructure in that county. Mesquite County, Colorado, same situation there. And then Michigan, multiple counties where individuals actually were able to steal the tabulators from the county and conduct tests on them. This is important because those compromises potentially impacted both of these major voting system brands. There were confirmations of getting copies of not only voting data, but copies or being able to troubleshoot and test and potentially determine vulnerabilities for software and hardware. Let's jump into a little bit of the data, and then we'll circle back to election systems across the years. So, expert methodologies. If you are familiar with our work at this point, then this gentleman's name may ring a bell to you. If not, this is Dr. Peter Klimek. He is a physicist with a PhD in physics. He also has habilitation, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, this is new to me as well, just learn this. This is one of the highest forms of education or degree you can get in some European countries. So that's interesting that, he has this in computational science, which is huge because a lot of his work deals with analyzing voting data using computers and data analysis. So why is he important? Well, he has co-authored some of the most credible work for detecting election fraud to date. So what his method does is it flags a strong relationship between polling locations. So these are all polling locations in Russia. A strong relationship between the turnout of a location and the benefit to one candidate. So to keep in mind, this is all the voting data after it's already been cast and counted. So there's no time component to this. All it's showing is that if we look at the voting behavior across precincts of low turnout, or polling locations in this case in Russia, if we look at low turnout polling locations versus all of these other higher turnout polling locations, are we seeing a relationship that could be caused by vote manipulation? So this is a visual. These heat maps are visuals of this for 2011, 2012, Uganda. And they also put in their paper that more normal should look like a circle, more of a normal distribution of votes. If we see an up and to the right or even like an up and down distortion, it could be caused by problems. And he estimates how many of these locations, these polling locations, could be impacted. And we have done the same. So the way his method works is, for example, 2011 here, he has two categories. He has incremental fraud, which is the areas that fall within this area and that, have, potential impacts to them. And then he has extreme fraud, which is areas that are sitting at or above 100% turnout, which, so those are two methods he looks at. And for example, 2011, he flags in this analysis and in this report that around 64% of all of these locations for the country exhibit incremental fraud, which is this effect, this trail here. And then 3% exhibit extreme fraud, which is this near 100 or at 100% turnout. We are now going to look at how we've applied this to Minnesota. Minnesota for the 24 election, going all the way back to 1984. And I'll run through this very quickly. One thing you do need to know is the baseline that Klimek says is, 5% or above is really his threshold. So 5% is enough to where the noise, it's more than just noise. It could be a problem, could be a pattern. And then above that, so 5% and above. So looking at this left to right, first and foremost, you have your minimum estimated fraud in purple. You have your maximum in orange, and your average in green. These are just different sensitivity levels when looking at, are these precincts, in this case, exhibiting a behavior or a correlation. So let's talk left to right here. Sum this up. 1984 to 1992. This is very important because, I guess we'll start with the most pressing and most concerning thing that we summarized, which is 2016 to 2024. We are seeing a very high and strong threshold for estimated fraud. To summarize, in 2016, we're seeing anywhere from 5% to 15% of the precincts in the state of Minnesota are exhibiting a behavior that has been flagged as incremental fraud. As we said, the concerns there are going to be if there's a relationship between turnout and vote share for one candidate. This is the Republican candidates. We're looking at the Republican candidate in these types of analysis. In 2020 and 2024, we see that incremental fraud detection threshold goes up a lot. We see anywhere from 20 to 30% of the precincts exhibit a behavior that is consistent with known examples of vote manipulation. And then early 1996 to 2004, we do have around that 5% maximum estimated fraud threshold that is kind of flagged here. Well, what's interesting is this is when we started to see the adoption of some of these more widespread optical scanners. And on top of that, these election years are notorious for having problems with our elections. If you're familiar, 2000, Florida, hanging chads, Bush versus Gore, problems there. 2004, Ohio, man-in-the-middle attacks. So it's interesting that we see a little bit of these concerns then, but not a lot, very small amount. Although we see up to 30% of the precincts exhibiting this behavior, Minnesota still stayed blue throughout all of these elections. One interesting piece is ES&S being the major voting system used in Minnesota. Dominion is another component as well. Well, we see an adoption of the DS200 version of the precinct counting systems starting around 2016. So before that, they were using slightly older models, slightly older software. So we really see that is interesting how ES&S has become the major voting system going into the early 2000s and then up to 2016, and then the adoption of that new version, that new system. And then we're detecting in the data these problems. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other impacts, and then we'll actually show you the data a bit more granularly. So mail-in versus election day. This has always been a question for us. Well, one thing to flag is how mail-in has been more impactful in recent elections. So prior to 2016, mail-in wasn't as common in Minnesota. In 2016, we saw a rise in the amount of mail-in voting because you didn't need an excuse. You could just do it as your default. In 2020, we saw a skyrocketing of mail-in voting. The largest to date so far. And this was attributed to COVID, potentially. And then 2024, we see it fall back down to lower levels, but not as low as 2016. Now, this is interesting. Why? Because one thing to know as we go forward and we're looking at this data is we count our mail-in voting with different models at the county level versus at the in-person early voting at the precinct level. We count them with DS200s for ES&S or other versions or other models like that. So it is a different model. Some places, older models were, the model 650 for, I believe, ES&S. And then some of the newer models now are DS450s and DS850s. And these are the central count systems. We use the process mail-in absentee voting. Mail-in also seems to have a stronger chain of custody. Generally, the county has a record of who requested a mail-in, who got sent a mail-in ballot, and who returned a mail-in ballot, and then obviously the counts of those ballots. So that is important. Stronger chain of custody. If you were to want to influence mail-in voting, it may get a little bit more of a review than election day early voting where you don't have that stronger chain of custody. Now, with that in mind, let's get into the actual analysis, visualizations, heat maps, and stuff. This is where we get a little more granular for you. What does normal look like first and foremost when looking at election day, election voting behavior under this microscope of the work of Peter Klimek and other experts? Remember what we said? We said that in Russia, the x-axis is turnout for these locations. Y-axis is the vote share of any one candidate. This is Putin. And if there is a strong relationship, it creates an up and to the right comet trail effect. This relationship is flagged as maybe ballot stuffing in this case. In a more free and fair election, a modeled free and fair election, we should see more of this circle of voting behavior. And when looking at Erie County, Pennsylvania, this is covered in our lawsuit as well, we see that for mail-in voting, even looking at Trump's voting data, we see for x-axis, y-axis turnout versus vote share, just like in the work of Peter Klimek in his paper, we're seeing that more circular, normal distribution voting. We're not seeing this up and to the right trend. We're not seeing a strong relationship between turnout and vote share. And that's important. So mail-in is looking far more normal. We see this pretty consistently across the U.S. Mail-in looks almost always far more normal. Now, when we compare that to election day voting, remember, different systems, by the way, different systems, different process, election day. We start to see problems in election day across 4 out of the 7 swing states that we've analyzed so far. And in this case, this is Erie County presidential election 24 election day. This is Donald Trump's portion as well. And we see that concerning effect that has been flagged in Russian elections, this up and to the right relationship. As we have visualized those major elections, 2016, 2020, 2024, and then the earliest voting data we currently have, which is 1984, Ronald Reagan. So we're comparing the Republican candidates for all of these, which is important because Ronald Reagan had a landslide victory. He had a majority of the popular vote. I believe he won almost every state in the U.S. One of the states I believe he didn't win was Minnesota. So interesting, we see this effect. Now, we're going to compare that. So when looking at Minnesota back in 1984, we still see far more of that normal circular distribution of votes, far more normal. When looking at 2016, 2020, and 2024, we do see a bit more of this tail, this trail. Keep in mind, Russia was attributed to ballot stuffing, as I mentioned before. If this is vote manipulation, one of the causes that could create this symptom here may be vote switching. And if it's occurring in some precincts versus others, or high turnout, low turnout precincts, whatever, it could create this distortion. So we're seeing this effect in 2016, 2020, and 2024, and it actually gets stronger from 2016 and 2020, and then stays about as strong from 2020 to 2024. Keep in mind, this is all of the votes, by the way. And if mail-in shows a more normal distribution and election day shows the concern, then it makes sense that mail-in having a huge impact on elections in 2020 could have or prevented the impact at scale. Now let's look at breaking this down a bit more visually for you. This is all in our report. And so this is just another version of those heat maps. Same thing, but instead of a 3D heat map, we have a 2D graph. And x-axis is turnout, just like the heat maps. Y-axis is vote share. And really what we're showing is we're saying if we group all of the precincts that fall within these turnout levels. There's no time component, by the way. So this is after all of the votes are cast and counted in every precinct in the state. So precincts of low turnout, 30 to 40%, 40 to 50, all the way up to 60 to 70, versus these higher 70, 80, 90, 100% almost precincts, so 90 to 100%. So we've grouped them, we've binned them. And really what we're showing here is that if this was a normal human voting behavior, such as like mail-in in Erie County, we would expect to see more of a flat line here. So precincts of low turnout, precincts of high turnout, we would expect to see it a bit more consistent and flat across all levels. If we're seeing a strong relationship, it creates this type of effect where the benefiting party at low turnout may not have a majority of votes, but in precincts of higher turnout, where more votes were cast and counted, one candidate is disproportionately benefiting. And it creates this type of effect. So it's interesting that we see this type of effect here. This effect is consistent with known examples of vote manipulation in other elections like Russia. This relationship. And what's even more interesting is when we compare Minnesota for the 24 election and all these other elections, where else in the U.S. use the same type of voting systems during the 24 election? So Minnesota had a predominantly ES&S and a little bit of Dominion. Well, let's compare it to some of the other impactful states in the U.S. We have on the left here 3 counties in Florida, some of the largest counties in Florida, Miami, Palm Beach, and St. Lucie. And on the right, we have Pennsylvania, all of the counties, all of the precincts. So this is precincts across all of those areas. And so we're pretty much just saying, let's see if there's a problem with our voting systems. If there is a concern of a known compromise, successful compromise, and known vulnerabilities to these systems, and someone was to exploit these systems and change votes during an election, well, one of the effects may be, if it's done with an algorithm, if it's done with malware that changes votes based on turnout or vote count, but one of the effects may be an algorithmic relationship. And that's what we're flagging in these analyses, is we are seeing that if there is a compromise of these systems and votes are being changed, we have raised concerns of an algorithm that seems to scale the amount of votes for one candidate based on the turnout of precincts, meaning precincts of lower turnout, in this case 0 to around 50, 60% turnout, benefit or have more votes for the Democratic candidates. But then precincts of higher turnout, 60% and above, if there's an algorithm, we see that turnout always benefits on average the Republican candidate at these higher turnout precincts. What's interesting here is this doesn't seem to just be, if this was ballot stuffing, it almost seems to be, if this is an algorithm, it could be doing many things. It could be switching votes, scaling with turnout, or vote count. Generally, they go hand in hand. And not only that, once a certain threshold is met, somewhere between 55, 60% or so on average, then we start to see stabilization, which is interesting because if this is caused by changing votes, adding in votes even, well, this type of stabilization could also be caused by deleting votes after changing so much or keeping a consistent rate of change. Final visual for you, showing you the same concern in a different way. This is in addition to the Minnesota report. The Minnesota report mostly just goes into the elections and the flagging and the concerning of those elections analyzed. But to scale up and out, we're seeing the same type of behavior in Florida, in Minnesota for congressional races, in presidential races, and then Pennsylvania as well. So it's interesting when we overlay all of those different unique locations, we still see low turnout precincts. Democrats are sitting a little higher, and then places of higher turnout begin to benefit one candidate across all of these unique locations. We see that effect here. If you want to read the report yourself, go to electiontruthalliance.org. It's on our main page, or you can go to analysis, and here it is. We'll have a short form added as well, so you've got the long form. We are working on the rest of the swing states to publish. We're diving deeper into Florida, and we're still pursuing legal action in Pennsylvania. So if you want to stay up to date, please go sign up on our Election Truth Alliance newsletter. You can sign up here, provide your email. If you want to volunteer, we are still actively taking volunteers. We've got a whole list of new volunteers where you guys have volunteered, and we're following up and sending out emails and stuff. So you can kind of provide a little bit of your background, your information. And then, of course, we have our donation. We had some issues with our donation system recently, so we had to incorporate a new donation system. And in this case, we've updated it now. You have, the donate button on the side as well. And we have now using DonorBox for the temporary solution. We'll see if it persists long terms. You can leave us a comment. So if you do want to donate, please, currently our fundraising needs, we have raised, I believe, over $300,000. We've spent at least $60,000 on legal action so far. And we're wanting to expand that pending which way the Pennsylvania lawsuit goes, in Florida and other places as we get closer to the midterms. I think that'll be important. And of course, if you do want to donate, you can hit the donate button. We've added the option, and it seems to work now, where you can do a monthly donation or a one-time donation. I would say, for the line of work we do, even just a $5 monthly donation is amazing, because if it's monthly, it lets us build up and out kind of a monthly budget as we continue, which lets us know how much more can we push if we want to do, publicity. Billboards is a big one right now to get this information that we're putting out, but also where we can expand our legal action as we go forward, because legal is expected to continue to be and to grow into more of our costs. So I think that's kind of the summary of everything so far. I'd say thank you guys so much for the work. Our volunteers have been killing it, but your support is always amazing. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I want you to be safe. I want you to keep an eye out for some of our new stuff as we go forward, and we'll go from there.